I would say I have one very important story that I come back to over and over again. And it's a story about an abbot who runs a monastery full of monks. And it's a beautiful monastery with a lovely garden. And at the back of the garden is a big forest. And there are deer that live in the forest. And there's a particular young deer who wanders into the garden. And the young monks in the monastery, perhaps they're working in the garden or helping in the garden in some way, and they like the deer coming in to their garden out of the forest, and they encourage it, and they might give it a little bit of food or some milk or something like that. And so the deer becomes used to coming into the garden and there's a sense of friendliness between them, the monks and the deer. And the abbot, when that comes to his notice, that the monks are encouraging the deer to come in, he rushes out, waving his arms, and he appears to be quite angry, and he drives the deer away. And of course, the deer, being young, is frightened and runs away into the forest. And the abbot has to repeat this a number of times every time the deer tries to come back to the garden. And he rushes out, appearing to be very angry, waving his arms in anger, and chasing the deer out of the garden and back into the forest. And the young monks are very unhappy about this because they can't see what they're doing wrong. They're treating a creature with kindness, with generosity. And the abbot has to explain to them that the deer is not used to human beings and gardens where there is plentiful food. And if the young deer grows up thinking that all human beings are their friends and that there's always going to be food for them, then that isn't good for the deer. And so that's an important story to me, because when I go out into the world and I'm mixing with people and I'm helping at a homeless centre in Reading with people who are vulnerable, then I hold that story. It's always there in the back of my mind, and it makes me reflect on what am I doing and how am I relating to people. And I question, am I doing something because it's good for me? Or am I doing something because it's good for the people that I might be trying to help and be kind to? So it's always there to help me to work out what's good to do.
Well, Buddhism has lots of stories, especially about the Buddha's life. But one of the stories I'd like to talk about, or tell, if you like, is a very nice story. And what it points to, what it shows us, is that we can get over all sorts of things where we feel everything's against us. And we feel a bit down, and we feel life's not going to get any better, and why is it like this, and why is people horrible to me, that sort of thing. And this shows us a way of how we can cope with that. And it's a story about a farmer who had a donkey. And he had his farm, and on that farm was a deep well. And the donkey was doing its business and then had a break, wandered towards the well, and fell in the well, unfortunately, right to the bottom of this deep well. And the farmer realised the donkey wasn't there, went looking for him and found him, he was down the well. But he had a think, and he thought, well, hang on, the donkey's really quite old. I was probably going to retire him at some point. It's going to take a lot of effort getting him out of this well. And he called over a couple of his farm hands. They said, let's just fill in the well and that'll be done with it. So they started doing that, although they weren't very happy about it. They started doing that. And as the soil came down and landed on the donkey's back, he sort of looked up and he shook it off. And it fell onto the ground. And they kept shoveling in. Every time it fell on him, he shook it off. And as he did this, he slowly rose up the well as the soil got higher. And because the soil got higher, he could see the top of the well much more clearly, and he just kept shaking it off, and they weren't aware of what was going on, so they kept shoveling and shoveling. And he just got to the top and walked out of the well and wandered off. And what I really like about that story is that sometimes life can feel like you're having dirt shoveled onto you, and you're being buried by it. And when I think about it, I think, well, actually there's been times in my life where I've allowed myself to be buried. I've just said, well, I can't do anything about this. But the donkey showed me that all I have to do is just shake it off, and I'll be able to step out of the well and carry on with my life. And I think that's a very beautiful story that children and adults can learn from.